So we just went through chapter 24 on vision and overall understanding of what vision is from a structural component, so understanding the structures of the eyes, the nerves from the eyes, the parts of the brain that control how our brain sees information. We talked about different pathologies of the eyes, from macular degeneration, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, to related to neurological events, so hemianopsias and visual field loss, and inattentions and neglects. So we talked about all that, and then I think I briefly was touched on perception. So now, how does perception impact vision, and how perception impacts cognition? So when there's been changes to the visual system that change how we perceive our world, how that can affect both vision and cognition. So perception is basically how our brain interprets sensory information that we receive from the environment. So that can come through the visual system, that can come through the sensory system, that can come through auditory system, like all of our systems, how we perceive our world. And then this perceived information is processed through the various centers of our brain. So our frontal lobe receives this information, our temporal lobe is, we know, which houses our communication, areas of communication, our parietal lobe, where we have our sensory systems, frontal lobe, where our cognition or executive functioning is housed, as well as our motor cortex is there. So we might have changes perceptually in motor, in communication, vision, all of the above. So because we could have these perceptual changes, let me rephrase that, because we can have changes in language, how we perceive and understand language, motor responses, cognitive changes, vision changes, we can't just use one modality for assessment. So we need to incorporate all of those modalities as we assess occupational performance. We are using verbal assessments, motor assessments, nonverbal assessments. We're using a lot of observation, some screens, but really in this context, we're probably doing more putting them into action, seeing what they're able to do, and making our assessments that way. And there are, as we know, two approaches for our intervention. So there might be the remedial approach, where we are transferring that learning for recovery, versus an adaptive approach, where we are using our treatments to adjust to the disability or to the deficits. So remedial, where we recognize that they're going to have recovery and that they're going to be functioning virtually at their typical place, versus that adaptive approach, where we need to adjust and modify so that they're then able to be as independent as possible. So what are some of these perceptual disorders? I'm not going to go too much into them because I believe these are on your lab worksheet. But if we're thinking about nosias, so these are awareness of how our body is moving. So agnosia is having this lack of awareness that there are any sort of motor deficits. So this plays directly into having awareness and insight into their deficits. There is all of these other gnosias, which, as I said, I believe is in your worksheet, and if it's not in your worksheet, you will then add these to your worksheet, which I think is also part of the assignment. So you might also see these figure ground challenges, form constancy, position in space, right-left discrimination, stereopsis, which all of them really boil down to how we are perceiving our body and space in relation to everything around it, in relation to ourselves, in relation to the object near us, walking, sitting. So how our brain is perceiving all of this sensory input, and then how we're able to use it. So if you have somebody with a homonymous hemianopsia, so visual field deficit, and also has a deficit in awareness of where their body is in space, can you imagine what that feels like, what that looks like for your client? And so these are things that you need to start to assess as soon as you walk into the room. Are they not turning to see you when you walk into the room? And are they perceptually positioned all the way towards their left in the bed because they, number one, don't see half of their environment, so they're just missing a lot of things, but also perceptually they're not feeling and recognizing where their body is in space, and they just don't have awareness of how big the bed is, and now they've pushed themselves all the way towards the left. So these are things that you'll start to observe, because observation is really going to be probably your best key in understanding what's going on with your client. Some other types of perceptual disorders that you might come across: your astragnosias, morphogynosias, agraphesthesias, body scheme perception disorders. And these all have very nuanced differences, but they can look very similar. So understanding kind of what those differences are. But when you go through your worksheets and you start to transcribe what the definition is and then what those disorders look like, and I think that will be very helpful. And so this is the neurobehavioral part that you'll see that in your Pedretti text. You'll see cognition, cognitive perception, and then you'll see neurobehavioral. And these neurobehavioral the apraxias kind of fall into that category, and this is your motor planning. And motor planning within the context of, so praxis, motor planning, apraxia, impairment with motor planning. You'll oftentimes see your apraxias related to temporal lobe, parietal lobe injury, because it's more of a from a language motor planning perspective versus from a frontal lobe perspective where it's motor planning because of organization and sequencing. So that takes a bit of understanding to kind of tease up those apart. But when you see somebody with a right brain lesion, with a left brain lesion and presenting with right deficits, the apraxias, you're probably going to be using that as your what the dysfunction is, versus somebody with frontal lobe injury and they're just disorganized, poor sequencing from the perspective of cognition. So kind of understanding what the difference between those are is going to be very important. But your different types of apraxias, which we will go over, and apraxia and aphasia oftentimes very much go together, because if you have a left brain lesion, you'll have oftentimes a motor planning as well as language, disorders of language. And there can be motor planning of the mouth as well, which can be confused with aphasia when it's actually just the person being able to use their mouth the way they want. So all of this is like your big takeaway. You cannot tell somebody with poor awareness that they have a deficit if they don't think they do. Insight and self-awareness is like the hardest thing to help someone understand, and it takes a lot of creativity and putting them in situations where they need to get feedback from other people and other other like groups, or being out in the environment where they're then confronted with their peers and just lots of stimuli and experiences, which then can help develop that self-awareness. But it really is part of the process for helping people through when they have these perceptual disorders. So we'll talk more about that, but I just want to give this a little brief overview. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you all later.